Okay students, so this is going to be a video about 10-15 minutes, something along those lines, and it's designed to help A2, that's the second year of A-level literature students with their coursework. They've got an independent coursework project where you have to read 2 novels independently and compare them. So one of the great things about it is you get to read a variety of texts. It's your choice, it's your research, it's independent, but at this stage of the year, that's the start of the year, a lot of students make some really big errors in terms of how they've approached it, or really get themselves stuck in terms of what they're doing. It is possible, and I don't want anybody to feel sad about this, it will be the case that several students' first drafts will have to be started again because they simply haven't done the right thing, and part of an independent project is the ability to make mistakes and learn from them and then try something again and realise when it's not working, when you try something that's not really going to work out. So there's a video just designed to help you with those coursework projects. Obviously we're all doing different texts, so it's focusing on, well, what does it mean to do a good independent coursework project? What are the things you can say, what are the things you can't say, what would it be silly to say about texts, and what would be interesting to say about texts, okay, particularly novels. Okay, so the first thing I've got here, if everybody can see that, let me just double check, is I've got a selection of essay titles. Now, I know it seems like a backward step, but if you're getting some feedback about your essays, or you've tried your essays, it's just not working, the first thing you need to do is go back to that question and think, is this question actually something that will help me give an answer that is literary, that is about literature, that's about essentially novels and how they're put together by authors, not about authors themselves or the biographies, and definitely not about characters as if they are real, but about how novels have been crafted. So I'm just going to show you these possible titles. Don't worry if they're not your text, I hope you'll get the message in terms of those titles and just some changes you can make to get the best out of your own piece. So I'm just going to put some big crosses next to these 3 titles. They are really bad titles, they are really bad questions. Okay, so let's go look through and see why that is, why it is that they are bad questions. An essay analysing mental health in American Psycho and the Bell Jar. Okay, now it's not a bad choice of idea. Mental health is clearly a theme, the issue of mental health, but one of the issues here is it's far too broad. An essay about mental health is essentially all that is. I'd also be very concerned with this, that what you're going to do with a question like that is analyse the protagonists of those texts as if they're real, and they're not. So anything where you're going to come forward with your conclusion is, oh, did you know that Holden in that Easton Ellis has created a protagonist who's a bit mad? Well, you know, the title of the text is American Psycho. Oh, did you know that Essa in the Bell Jar is suffering from depression? Well, of course. I mean, the first line of a Wikipedia page would tell you this. But the question is how and to what extent, and what has an author done as an author to create that sense of a breakdown of psychology. So rather than having it's about mental health, what about something along these lines, these 2 possibilities here? To what extent is the theme of mental instability central to the text? And that's much more a question of what an author has done to make that theme a central issue within the text. It's about its significance within the text, its meaningfulness within the text. Or this, how do Plath and Easton Ellis craft rounded, psychologically interesting protagonists? That's not about, are those protagonists rounded and psychologically interesting? They're not real. It's about, what has an author done with language, with words, with literary techniques to create a sense of a rounded, psychologically interesting protagonist, or even a protagonist suffering from a mental disorder. I do not want anyone to diagnose what particular mental disorder a character in a text has. They're not real, so you can't do it. You might, for example, want to suggest that an author is taking existing mental disorder, doing something with it, exploring it, challenging preconceptions about it, transgressing it, but that's what an author has done as an author, not about what characters are like as real people. Okay, this next one is a similar problem. Are Winston Smith and Offred isolated characters? So that's Winston Smith from 1984 and Offred from, goodness, I haven't read it in a long time, A Handmaid's Tale. So Winston Smith isolated characters. There's 2 problems with that. Again, it's going to help make you deal with them as if they're real. They're not. And it's a question which really can give you a yes or no answer. So what's your conclusion going to be? are they or are they not? Well, yeah, they are. The interesting question is how they are isolated, or what the authors have done to craft that sense of isolation. So rather than are they like this, if your title is something that could be answered with a yes or a no, you really need to rethink that title, that question. How do Orwell and Atwood represent the theme of isolation? What's the theme and how is it represented? And that key word, representation, that's something that an author does, not what a person is like. And then again, to what extent do Orwell and Atwood represent isolation as the greatest horror imaginable? One of the things you can do is, if you're struggling with where to go or what to say next, I often get students saying, I don't know what to write. Well, think about a question and perhaps change it to a to what extent question, adding a what extent, because you can almost conclude that with almost like a percentage. Well, I do agree to an extent and here's why, or well, partially I agree and here's why, or to an extent I agree and here's why, or not very little in one case but very much in another case and here's why. That's about evidence and weighing it and looking through the text to find that evidence, rather than just, oh, there's some isolation in there, look. You know, well, to what extent is isolation seen as the greatest possible horror, and how do you know? What has the author done to create that sense of, oh my goodness, this is far worse than anything else? Okay, so you could perhaps look at some other forms of horror with a question such as that. And of course, this is a lesson that you can learn for any question, trying to get in a what extent or a how or a representation, an open question that leads to a thoughtful conclusion, not just a yes or a no. And then obviously, you know, a similar problem here, an essay on fear in The Woman in Black and the Turn of the Screw. I mean, one of the things that might be a problem is, you know, if you've got a text that is scary and your question is on fear, I'm not sure what you're going to do with it. If it's just, oh, what's fear like in these texts? Well, they have, if they're ghost stories, if they're, you know, gothic stories, if they're designed to be scary, and your question is essentially, oh, are they scary? I'm not sure what you're going to do with it. So there's nothing really interesting about saying The Woman in Black and the Turn of the Screw are scary. The real question is how that sense of fear is crafted. What have they done with their language, with their words, to craft it? How are they different from one another? And also remember, this is a literature question. This is that we're studying literature. It's not language, and it's certainly not biography. It's not, you know, what are authors like? You know, they had cornflakes for breakfast, and they didn't like it, so therefore they went on to write the greatest Gothic story in history. This is not what we're interested in. It's literature. So try and think about, well, what do I know about literature? What can I learn about literature, say, genre, that will help me to answer this question? So how did the authors of The Woman in Black and the Turn of the Screw utilise Gothic elements to craft terror and horror? So if you were doing Orwell and Atwood, it would be like dystopian elements. What's the genre? A quick Wikipedia will help you understand what the genre of those texts are, and then think, well, do I really know what is normal for that genre? Authors are not working in isolation, they're working within genres, or they're combining genres, or they're doing something interesting as an author with a genre. They're subverting its conventions or going against what's normal. So trying to write from the start, I want a question that's going to show I know what literature is, I know how to analyse text, and it's not going to be a simple yes or no answer. Going back to those questions is the first thing I would say to do if you're really struggling, or if it's just not quite working out. Okay? And remember, we've got to have questions that work and lead towards a conclusion. You do actually have to have a conclusion to your question. Okay, and of course you can change the questions later if you need to in subsequent drafts. Okay, so I'm just going to flip this over without making too much of a mess. Okay, the next thing I'd say is that we need to prepare properly. Now, obviously, you know, you've got deadlines fast approaching. These are supposed to be in quite quickly, but we want you to put in lots of work if it's not quite working out. Your teachers get into the situation sometimes where we're marking 4, 5, 6 drafts, and every time we're giving the same advice. Every time we're giving the same advice, which is stuff that essentially could be remedied by you going back to the basics, the preparing to write, not just sitting down at a computer and hoping that things come out, but have you prepared properly? Do you really know what it is you're setting out to do, and have you done the legwork, the donkey work, to make sure you've got enough in place that you can then write the essay? And if you haven't done this legwork and you've written 2,000 words, but we're saying most of this just doesn't get marks, you do need to go back and put in some more of that basic legwork first. So you need to think about a proper question. Okay, so if you're bringing up drafts and you still haven't rethought that question in terms of what we just talked about, you really need to go back to it. you need to have a sense of argument or direction. Now that might not come out in a first draft, but you do have some sense of, there is actually something I've got to argue here. I do have to present and weigh evidence. I do actually have to explore the meanings that these texts are generating, different possible interpretations, and I do actually have to have an opinion on it that I've got as an expert in literature. And that means having a think about conclusion. When I'm writing an essay, I think of my conclusion first. I think, what quite clever but not madly complicated thing am I going to say in answer to my question, and then how do I get there? And that's where the evidence comes in. So not everybody works like that. I understand not everybody does that, but you do have to have a real think about, well, what am I actually getting to here? Is this just 2,000 words of anything on those texts, or am I actually trying to build a case? And you do actually have to build a case. That means you want to get somewhere with a conclusion. This one is, I can't tell you the number of times that we've had this issue where, you know, drafts just aren't quite working, or students are saying, I don't know what to write, and it emerges that the student hasn't read both texts properly. Now, some of these texts are really challenging, and that might be an issue. You might need to think, well, I get one of them, but what, not the other? Can I quickly, you know, perhaps change to another text that I understand a bit better? But given where we are in terms of the coursework, you do really need to go back to those texts and read them again. You know, several times is pretty normal, but at least once really thoroughly, and not in the way you'd read for pleasure. I hope you do get pleasure from the text, but this is an independent study, this is coursework, so you do need to read them again thoroughly. Okay, knowing the texts intimately, knowing what happens when, to whom, in what context, what the authors are doing, how they've structured the text, you know, all of those things, that's really got to be a given before you can think about producing something of a decent essay. This is my most important one. Oh, my hair fell out there. This is most important bit. The students, when they say I'm stuck or I don't know what to write next, my advice is always primarily the same, which is find bits of the texts and analyse them with terminology. This is your fallback position. This is the basics of what it is to analyse texts, to do literature. Find bits of each text and analyse them with terms. I'm going to show you how to do that in a minute. But by bits, I mean sections. I mean essentially pages. Not just one single line that demonstrates that Holden is mad, you know, not just one single line that shows that this text is scary, but a significant extract, like a page of a text. Yeah, and of that you're gonna, you know, you can photocopy it, highlight it, show you how to do that, and something where you can get your terminology out and analyse it, and you do that before you start writing the essay. You know, exactly as you would do in class. We put in front of you an extract, and we give you time to tease out terms and to find bits and to really get to grips with it. That's the nuts and bolts of what English is. If you haven't done that for your essay, you are never going to get good marks in it. Okay, so have you found bits, and hopefully bits of each text that sort of marry up in some way and link to your question? At least 3 or 4 really significant chunks of each text that you could say several things about, you could analyse in some depth. Background reading. Now, some of you are really advanced with this. You're doing really advanced critical material already. You're going to the library, you're getting those critical material in place. But everybody needs to be doing some background reading in terms of even just Wikipedia to get you in your own head, why is this a significant text? Why does this text matter? What is interesting about that text? Not what happens, not what the characters are like, but what has the author done? Why is it on this reading list? Why is it something that's as worthy of discussion? Has it done something with the genre? Is it a great element of this genre? Does it combine 2 new genres? Is the author doing something critical or unusual or transgressive? Is there some sort of argument around it? And a quick Wikipedia will help you with this. What do people say about that text, and what have they said about it in the past? That's the starting point to understand what's normal in the discussion of those texts. And then leading on from that are, well, what are the debates about those texts? Not what are the characters like, is there a debate about whether he's mad or not, or, you know, but what are the debates about what the authors were up to, what they were doing as craftspeople, what's significant about it? Is it a fantastic example of a Bildungsroman? Is it a fantastic example of a dystopian text? How? What does it do with those traditional elements? What are the debates about them? Okay, so what would somebody who knows about literature talk about? in terms of that text. They wouldn't keep on talking about, oh, did you know that this happens at the end? Or, oh, did you know that it was written by this person and they were sad when they wrote it? It would be, well, as a novel, what's going on? Is there something in terms of genre? Is there something in terms of structure? Is there something recurring techniques such as unreliability that's crafted in an unusual way? Has it been copied later by other people? Literature is what we're doing. It's literature, not character study and not biography. Okay, so just a quick Wikipedia, a couple of bits of background reading will help you to understand what's the types of debates about these texts, the types of things that people who know about literature talk about. Okay, so that preparation has to be done, and that will be stuff that will help. If it's not working out, don't just go to your first draft of your 2,000 words if it's not working, or 300 words if you just can't think what to write, and sit wanting to do it. Get back and do some background work. So get back and do the basics, the legwork first. Okay? So this is my sort of big piece of advice about every text, really. We've got Catcher in the Rye, we've got Holden, we've got Winston Smith from 1984. It applies to any text. You have to remember that these are not real people. Okay? I'll just have a little sip of coffee, lighten the mood slightly. Okay, they're not real, and I know you know this, but you cannot write as if they are. So I don't want you to be telling me, Holden is very depressed, Winston is very scared. They're not real, and you cannot write about them as if they are. I cannot give you decent grades if you do that, and the essay will not come together if you do. Now, part of that is a technical issue. Part of that is just how you start a sentence. So you start it with author, or with genre, or with reader, rather than starting that sentence with character. So, for example, rather than saying something like Holden loves his sister Phoebe, and we see this here, we would say something like Salinger crafts a sense of empathy between Holden and his sister Phoebe through what? And then that's the literary techniques, the language, the way in which the author has done that. So we start with the author. We could say things like Salinger's main concern seems to be, or Salinger constantly returns to, Salinger explores. These are all things that you can do. Salinger explores, or just change that with your own author of your text. Explores, or crafts, or focuses on, or complicates, or just represents something quite nice and simple. And then it's an idea of how, well, through what techniques, what have they done again and again and again. Okay, that's part of it. So it's a technical thing, but it's also about an approach thing. It's also about, well, what am I actually trying to do with this essay? What's the point of comparing these two texts? Perhaps the authors have done the same thing, but in different ways. Perhaps they've approached the same issue, but in very different ways. That's what I care about. What have they done? How have they done it? What's the author doing as a craftsperson? The other part of this, of showing you understand that the characters aren't real, is about where your conclusion is going, about what you're sort of trying to do. I've had several essays before on, say, the Bell Jar or the Catcher in the Rye, where the conclusion seems to be the characters are sad, or the conclusion seems to be that Salinger makes it clear that Holden's depressed because of his dead brother, or Plath makes it clear that Esther is depressed because society's sexist, and that's better, that's okay. But if you think anybody really could say that, like anybody, wouldn't really have to know the text to say that. So this is part of it, is essentially starting sentences to focus on what the author is doing as a craftsperson, as a literary constructor of meaning. But the other part of it is, am I really moving towards something where I can show I really understand what the author has done, or am I going to conclude something that's just going to be what anybody could say, even if they haven't really read the text, just a quick Wikipedia? So rather than saying, Salinger shows, but the conclusion being that, Plath shows that Esther is depressed because society is sexist, think around it. Like, has Plath simultaneously at the same time shown that society is both sexist and yet also shown how we internalize sexism, or shown that society is deeply unfair and yet at the same time shown that mental illness is not understood by that society. So just something a tiny bit more subtle that you're thinking all the time, what in the course of this novel has the author done? Okay, not just what does the author think necessarily, certainly not what the biographical details about the author, you know, what did they have for breakfast, none of that's relevant, and definitely not what are the characters like, but what have they done as a craftsperson of literature. Okay, so remember, they're not real, and I really do mean it. With Katie and I, for marking these drafts of coursework, we will not give you marks, we can't, and you know, if you're talking about characters, if they're real people, it's the number one thing we write in the margins of essays is they're not real, they're not real, they're not real. So change the way you're writing those sentences and change the way you're thinking about the structure of the essay, so you're focusing on what literature is and how authors are doing things as craftspeople of literature. Okay, I'll just flip that over. And this is the sort of the next fallback position, really, the sort of the nuts and bolts of what you can do more of to make it work. Now, if you're thinking, I don't really know what to argue, we can do that in subsequent drafts, it's not absolutely central. If you're thinking, I'm struggling what to write, that's fine, and I get how that's difficult when you're doing an independent project, okay? But what is not fine is if you don't do AO2, because that's the nuts and bolts of what literature is. This is what you've done since the age of, well, really 11, starting secondary school, with any literary text. You've used AO2, which is you've analysed it. Okay, you've analysed that text using terminology, sort of AO1 as well, really, but never mind. So how is the question. How an author does something, not what's happened, not what goes on, not what are the events, not what the characters like. How has an author done something? And that means terminology. I cannot accept drafts, and you shouldn't be producing drafts that don't have a significant range of literary terminology in it. This is the toolkit. The terminology is the toolkit that anybody who studies literature knows. It's the tools of the trade. So if you're not using those tools, you cannot get the job done and you cannot get marks for it. Okay? And thankfully it's quite easy. It just means going back and thinking about, well, what would I do in class if I was approaching this text, and how can I do that independently? And of course, when in class, what you do is you get bits of the text and you prepare by annotating it with terminology, and then you write it up. And that's exactly the same with your essays. You have to do this significantly in order to produce an essay that's going to work. So just making sure that you're aware of the types of terms that you can use when you're analysing text. Your metaphor, symbolism, sentence variation, are they short, are they long, are they changing? That syntax, the word order. Is there imagery? Ambiguity, is there a sense of uncertainty or perhaps ambivalence, two opposite things at the same time? Is there a sense of unreliability? That, you know, there's hundreds of literary terms that you can use, and sometimes we get essays with first drafts where there isn't any at all. And all we can say is you haven't done the legwork, you haven't gone back and thought about what do we do with literature. You've got to get some terminology in there significantly. Imagery, ambiguity, and reliability. Even think basically in semantic fields, for goodness sake. Like what has an author done with language, and what's the effect of that? If you're struggling with the terminology, I mean, you don't have to shoehorn it in. You can just say, well, through this, they craft a sense of what, like an emotion or a feeling in the recipient, in the reader. How have they created a sense of what? Is it a sense of unease, a sense of disquiet? Well, in this bit, there's a sense of fear. At this bit, there's a sense of beauty. How have those been done? What does the language do in order to craft it? That's the bit that gets you the marks. And the real sort of catch-all term is this creates a something quality. This creates a happy quality, a sad quality, an introspective quality. Just whacking an adjective in there and trying to focus on, well, what has the author done with that craft? Okay, so I'm just going to quickly show you how we do that. So the first thing is you get your text. Here I've got Catcher in the Rye. You'll have read it. You know what's going on. And you should know significant sections. Like if you were teaching this class on this text, which pages would you go to? Like which bits of that text you think, well, I've got to talk about that bit. So, I mean, by and large, it's going to be the first page, isn't it? That's going to be significant. There's going to be some other bits. I've got a bit near the end there, but I mean, just like forcing yourself, really forcing yourself, like at least 3 or 4 significant pages or events or few pages, scenes, I suppose, within those novels that you need to focus on in a great detail. Okay, so I'm not sure if you can see the whole of this text, but essentially what I would do is I would get this, and I would read that page really focused, and I would think about terms that I can apply, right? And I will show you how easy this can be if you get your terminology out, force yourself to look at a page. If you really want to hear about it, the first thing you'll probably want to know is where I was born and what my lousy childhood was like and how my parents were occupied and all before they had me and all that David Copperfield kind of crap. But I don't feel like going into it if you want to know the truth. Right. Now, there's so much in there that are going to be hallmarks of the entire novel that as a literary expert you should be able to see straight of all. Right from the start, if you, that's unusual. As a literary text, second person pronouns, get your terminology out. If you really want to hear about it, oh, a reluctance to tell us, that's unusual for a narrator. Is there a sense of an unreliable narrator there? The first thing you'll probably want to know, you'll, yeah? You'll, colloquial, low register, unusual for novels. You want to know is where I was born and what my lousy childhood was like. You'll want to know where I was born and what my childhood was like. Well, are those features of a certain type of text? What's the tone, the tenor, what's the tone of that? It seems like almost sarcastic, almost humorous. Is that unusual for a novel? And how my parents were occupied and all before they had me, and all that David Copperfield kind of crap. Some taboo lexis. David Copperfield, look it up. If it's something you don't understand, quick Wikipedia. David Copperfield is the name of an incredibly famous novel. It's a novel in a particular genre, the Bildungsroman. This is a genre which is essentially about how I grew up and where I was born and what my parents did, and then the charting the passage of life. So really interestingly, this protagonist, this narrator, is taking the mickey out of the conventions of literature from the start of the text. That's got to be interesting. That's got to be something significant. It's taking the mickey out of books. Is that normal for the author, for the narrator of a novel? That's weird. That's interesting. I don't feel like going into it. Wow, that's unconventional, isn't it, for a narrator? What, narrators of texts generally don't tell you stuff, do they not? Well, of course they do. That's really interesting. I don't feel like going into it. So there's a reticence, unusual. If you want to know the truth, the focus on that word truth at the end of the first sentence opens up these questions of reliability. So let's think of what we've got so far. We've got second person pronouns. We've got the use of colloquial lexis and abbreviations. We've got this sarcasm in the tenor. We've got this use of taboo lexis like lousy and crap. We've got these intertextual sort of references to other forms of literature, and we've got this subversive, weird take on the Bildungsroman genre. I can't do any of that unless I know my terms, unless I've looked at this in detail. Okay? And if it's there, I promise you, it'll continue. I promise you you'll see it, or it'll go somewhere. In the first place, that stuff bores me. In the second place, my parents would have had about 2 hemorrhages apiece if I told anything pretty personal about them. They're quite touchy about anything like that, especially my father. Just think about what's going on there. Well, it's not true, is it, that this is an uneducated character? Can you spell the word hemorrhage? This is a protagonist who's represented as intelligent and thoughtful. He knows about David Copperfield, can use the word hemorrhage, got quite a high register in places, but the rest of it is lower register and really, really colloquial, and it's got lots of taboo lexis in there. Okay, so this is just an example of what I need you to do with the text that you've got. Find 3 or 4 pages and get out, focus on those pages and get out your terminology. Photocopy them, annotate them, or just make some notes, but you want at least 5, 10, 15 bits of terminology that you can apply, and that will be the basis of a paragraph. Okay? If you get stuck and you're not analysing text, it's really easy. Find a page in the text and write about it. Find a page, get your terminology out and write about it, and that's the way you do it. Okay? So, hopefully that's slightly helpful. We'll just finish off with just a quick recap on what I was saying about preparation. Okay, so just to recap, make sure you go back to your question, redo that question if it's not something that's going to get the best out of you. Make sure you've thought about a sense of argument, what do you want to say, where you're going, and moving towards a conclusion in perhaps subsequent drafts. Most important, go back to the text, read them again, okay? The most important thing I can say in terms of the analysis, find bits of the texts, annotate them with terms, get your terminology out, use your terminology. We cannot give you any credit for paragraphs in your essay that don't have any terms in, because what are they if they're not bits of analysis of those texts? If you haven't got terminology, if you're not analysing the language, the way in which the author does something, we cannot give you any marks. Background readings, you know what's going on in those texts, maybe some critical reading in subsequent drafts, and then what are the normal debates about those texts. Okay, so that concludes that video. I hope that's helpful. Make sure that you know when you're submitting drafts for these essays, that they really are literature essays, that you really have done some background work on. And please don't be disappointed if we say, look, it really is back to square one. Hopefully this will help you to know what square one should look like and what you can do to sort of make this get the best of the situation. I mean, you know, we do expect everybody to get an A or a B for this coursework. There's no reason why not you can't get a high grade for this coursework. You get as many drafts as you like, really. Obviously we can only help you with a certain number of them. But if you get that, you get the preparation in place, you should do fantastically well. Okay, thanks very much.